Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World Center Speaker Series Winter 2022. So my name is Julie Babin and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the IOWC at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our second speaker series session. Our first event was held 2 weeks ago with Professor Gwyn Campbell, the director of the IOWC, who presented research on Madagascar youth in Britain during the early 19th century. For those of you who missed this talk and would like to hear more about it, it is available right now on the IOWC YouTube channel. And I will post the link to access the presentation in the chat room. And also for those of you who are here live, as with last week, this presentation will be recorded, but the recording will stop before the beginning of the Q&A session. The recording will then be posted on the IOWC YouTube account, enabling scholars in other time zones easier access to the core material. The presentation tonight will last 40 to 50 minutes, and after the presentation, I will stop recording and I will invite questions from the audience. If you have questions during the Q&A period, please use the raise hand function, and I will call on you to ask your question directly to Dr. Gooding. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Philip Gooding tonight. Philip Gooding is a postdoctoral fellow here at the IOWC, and he has earned his PhD in the History School of Oriental and African Study at the University of London. He has been working in the IOWC since 2018, and his research primarily focused on the 19th century Eastern Africa. He has published works on the history of Islam in the Journal of African History and Slavery, in Slavery and Abolition. And he has 2 books that are forthcoming in 2022. These are, firstly, his first sole author monograph entitled On the Frontiers of the Indian Ocean World, a history of Lake Tanganyika in 1830-1890s, and which will be published with Cambridge University Press and stems from his PhD research. His second book will be his first sole edited volume entitled Drought, Flood, and Global Climatic Anomalies in the Indian Ocean World, and will be published in the Palgrave series in the Indian Ocean World Studies. He is currently working on a project funded by SSHRC Inside Development Grants entitled Climate History and Human Environmental Interaction in Equatorial Eastern Africa, 1780-19th century. And it is from that project that today's presentation comes. I will post the links to all of this publication in the chat box. Please feel free to check it. Dr. Gooding, thank you for agreeing to give this presentation tonight. It is entitled The 1780s Global Climatic Anomalies in Eastern and Northern Africa. I now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Babin. I really appreciate it, that very kind introduction. As Dr. Babin kindly introduced, this paper stems from a broader project entitled Climate History and Human Environment Interaction in Equatorial Eastern Africa, circa 1780 to 1900. But this paper itself actually focuses on highland Ethiopia, which is hardly equatorial. So this paper is kind of an explanation to begin with of how I got here. What am I doing here presenting a paper on a region which is normally considered Northeastern Africa, when I set out to study regions of present-day Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda. And to kind of explore how I got here, I suppose, I'm firstly going to discuss my aims and methodologies with this broader project and kind of situate that in like recent developments in climate history and historical climatology. And then I'll discuss how these kind of methodologies and how I thought about this broader project led me to Highland Ethiopia, and I kind of saw as an opportunity to kind of explore this region, which I hadn't come to before. And I've kind of explained that what my findings are. And then I'll kind of return to equatorial regions at the end, kind of explore and discuss what the implications are from this study on Highland Ethiopia are within the context of my broader project on equatorial regions. So the aim of my broader project is to essentially integrate what we now know of historical climatic conditions into an understanding of Eastern African history in circa 1780 to 1900. And one of the challenges of pre-1900 Eastern African history, and this is well known to Africanist historians, is the source materials, or more precisely, the lack thereof. If we're going to talk about the bread and butter of what historians are normally used to, documents are sparse. Almost all of them were written by Europeans, and there are some exceptions. I don't want to imply that they all are written by Europeans, but the vast majority are written by Europeans, and they had highly racialized perspectives on the peoples and regions and environments they encountered. And for inland equatorial Eastern Africa, that kind of archive only starts in 1858 with some explorer texts, some kind of snapshots of the region, and then you only get kind of progress over longer periods of observations over longer periods, beginning from the end of the 1870s. There are also, in addition to this, retrospective accounts of the late 19th century written up, oral sources, for example, and often these oral sources are collected by European colonial administrators. And again, you can talk about the ear of the interpreter influencing how these oral testimonies were collected and then written down. As well as in some regions, and this especially applies to Buganda and present-day Uganda, written retrospective accounts as well of the late 19th century. But again, all these kind of sources that I've kind of listed here are limited to the second half of the 19th century, from the 1850s onwards. For earlier periods, historians have been reliant to a large degree on oral traditions. But one of the major problems with oral traditions, or one of the major challenges, it's not really problems, problems is the wrong word. One of the challenges of oral traditions is that they are notoriously difficult to place in time. How do you make a chronology in the positivist tradition, from oral traditions which don't necessarily have clear which don't have those dates attributed to them in the way they are told? Should we even be doing this? That's another question. Should historians even be attempting this? But I suppose that's another question. Within these, but despite these, I suppose, challenges with oral traditions, and this is when African history really became a discipline in universities from the 1960s onwards. Historians nevertheless saw that these oral traditions were probably the route into the pre-1850-ish history of Eastern Africa, and saw them as core, and therefore, despite these challenges, sought to place them in time in a chronology. Oral traditions often talked about dynastic changes. They often had reports of famines, of migrations. And these were seen, and often these famines and migrations, and even in some cases dynastic changes, were often triggered, according to oral traditions, by drought. And I'm definitely generalizing here. That reports of drought in oral traditions frequent are regular. And on the basis of, and again, these some general tendencies, on the basis of estimating average length of rains, historians writing in the 1960s and 70s reconciled this idea of an average length of rain with what they knew of climatic conditions to try and make a chronology for the deeper past, for the let's say, 1850 past in Eastern Africa. And these were incredibly ambitious projects. They are funded significantly. And certainly by the end of the 1970s, these kind of projects were very ambitious. Using these kind of methodologies, some historians, particularly in the project, the History in Uganda project, attempted to make chronologies going back to the end of the first millennium CE. Now, this seems like a major jump, and it probably, and someone I know in the audience I've seen and will be familiar with these histories. the vast majority of African scholarship started to become increasingly skeptical of all these findings. And some of the research was widely and wildly criticized in academic journals. And kind of this end of the 1970s, sort of when ethnicist historians have decreasingly looked at oral traditions. And instead of trying to reconstruct the pre-1850 past, have been more focused on, I suppose, the colonial period. There are two key issues as the critiques of this work had. One, the oral traditions were too difficult to place in time. I've already alluded to that above, and the other was that the climatic reconstructions that they're attempting to reconcile them with were simply not accurate enough. And both of these criticisms were absolutely valid at the time. My project, now we're in the 2020s, among other things, seeks to, I suppose, return to these kind of materials and reevaluate them and see what we can do with them now. And there's a couple there, and I'm going to try and deal with both of these issues in the project. But the oral traditions being too difficult to place in time, one, absolutely agreed, but I'm limiting my scope, only going back to around 1780, possibly to 1750, if I think it ends up being worthwhile. That's one issue. That's kind of one way of dealing with it. The other major criticism of the work was about the climatic reconstructions. Now in 2020, in the 2020s, we know so much more about the historical climatology of Eastern Africa than historians did writing in the 1960s and 1970s. We have a mixture of lake sediment analyses, some places tree ring analyses, pollen analyses, also multi-proxy reconstructions of global phenomena such as El Nino, which we know has effects on Eastern African rainfall. These are the kind of things we can now use in a way to kind of infer histories of the past with much more accuracy than was the case for scholars writing 50 or 60 years ago. So let's look at these climatic materials. So I mentioned lake sediment analyses, tree ring analyses, pollen analyses, and multi-proxy reconstructions. What were the historians of the 1960s and 1970s relying on? They were almost exclusively relying on the records of the rhodanilometer. The rhodanilometer is basically measured the annual flood of the Nile River in Cairo, in Egypt. And with some gaps in the data, there are annual maximum and minimum recordings of the Nile floods in Cairo from 622 CE. These records were collected and standardized and compiled by Omar Toussoun in 1925. Some of his methods have been, methods and findings and discussion have been modified since, most notably by Popper in 1951, but yet Toussoun's work remains the most exhaustive of all the kind of compilations of Nile records. As I'm sure everyone here knows, the Nile River, which is mapped here, has two main sources. It has the White Nile, which is this one going here from going from Lake Victoria and upwards, and it has the Blue Nile as well, the Chekezi at Barrow River, which both stem from the Ethiopian Highlands. The Blue Nile comes from Lake Tana in the Ethiopian Highlands. Now, the important thing to bear in mind here is that the Nile maximum, the annual maximum, when the Nile is at its maximum level in Cairo, 90% of the water comes via the Blue Nile in the Chekezi at Barrow River, which means that the annual maximum of the Nile River is a fairly good proxy of rainfall in the Ethiopian Highlands. The annual Nile minimum, meanwhile, 60% of the water comes from the White Nile, from the one whose source is Lake Victoria. This means, so 60% is obviously nowhere near as good as 90%. It means it's a very imperfect proxy for rainfall in equatorial regions. There is significant interference from rainfall falling in the Ethiopian highlands. And considering what I just said about this, that historians writing in the 1960s and 70s were reliant on the Nile minimum as their climate proxy for reconciling chronologies of all traditions, you can see why there are problems here, because this is actually a very, very imperfect proxy for rainfall in equatorial regions. So beginning my project, or getting stuck into my project really for early periods. I was really trying to focus on the earliest, most challenging periods for this. What will be the earliest and most challenging periods for this project? Where did I start? Without trying to be too, I suppose, self-critical or self-effacing, I started with the Nile records. Of course I did. But that's partly because I'd already kind of looked at some of the other proxies before, and I had not looked at these ones in so much depth because of knowing the criticisms of them. But also the Nile records do have an advantage of all the other proxies for rainfall in Eastern Africa, or the ones that you actually measured in Africa. And that is that they are an annual time series. There's a record, it's supposed to be a record for every single year. Whereas the other proxies for rainfall in the region, we mostly rely on lake sediments and pollen records. And these are better for measuring for changes over long periods. The most accurate change in lake records, for example, have suggested that a 5-year moving average is the best for, is the changing lake level reflects a 5-year moving average of rainfall. So this is, so in theory at least, the Nile records are good for having an annual time series, which means maybe you can get a degree of accuracy. So when I started with the Nile records, what did I see? So this picture here is a picture of the document within Two Students compilation. This is from volume 2, in which he basically documents all the or compiles all the records from 622 to the present. On the left here, you have minimum. You have minimum here, and on the right you have maximum. You have it in these ones I'm mostly looking at here, just for purpose of standardization. Meters and centimeters. This is the annual minimum. This is the annual minimum down here in meters and centimeters, and here you have it in meters and centimeters for the annual maximum. So for someone who's interested in equatorial Eastern Africa, which means I should be looking at the minimum, something that strikes you immediately from this data set is that there are a lot of gaps. We don't have any data, and I'm focusing this project on the 1780s. This paper on the 1780s, there's only one reading for the entire of the 1780s. The fact that that's the case makes you really question, like, why were they measuring it in this year, not in other years? And can we really trust it? And that's kind of a big question there. But in looking at this page in particular, trying to think about equatorial Eastern Africa, naturally look to the more complete data set, which is the maximum, which then my eye got drawn to this. And this is basically ground zero for this paper on the Ethiopian highlands. And obviously there's some little drawings on this paper. This is McGill Library's copy. I didn't do these, just an FYI. I just want to clear my name there. I don't know what they're doing there. But these are the most important measurements. These are incredibly low levels for the annual Nile maximum for 3 years, 1782, 1783, and 1784. The average for this century, the average Nile maximum was 19.21 meters. Here, the maximum we have for 3 years, we have more than 1.1 meters below average. According to Stephen Searle's recent monograph If you have it below 90 centimeters below average for 1 year, that was pretty disastrous. Here you have more than 1.1 meters below average for 3 years consecutively. This was, as historians such as Alan Mikhail has shown, disastrous for agriculture in Egypt. So, what caused this major low in the annual Nile flood, 1782 to 84? Now, the 1780s have received significant attention in global climatic history. In Northeastern African history, the core scholar has been Alan Mikhail, who wrote a pretty celebrated piece in environmental history entitled Ottoman Iceland, A Climate History in 2025, which was then published in his book Under Ottoman's Tree, published in University of Chicago Press in 2017, and then summarized it in an article by Vanita Damodaran and colleagues entitled The 1780s, which is published in the Palgrave Handbook of Climate History, edited by Sam White, Christian Pfister, and Franz Molschagen. The 1780s, particularly the early 1780s, were a period of drought, not just in Egypt, but also in India, Japan, Iceland, and Alaska, as well as several other places. There's also severe cold in Europe and much of North America. These are kind of all come together. What caused these abnormal global rainfall levels? There are two major hypotheses in some ways that are interlinked. One of them is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The El Nino Southern Oscillation is an anomaly of sea surface temperatures in the Eastern Tropical Pacific Ocean. When it's abnormally high, that's an El Nino year. When it's abnormally low, it's a La Nina year. And they contribute to disturbed atmospheric circulation, thereby also contributing to abnormal temperatures in some places, but most famously, abnormal levels of rainfall. And the 1780s are well known for having abnormal El Nino activity, most notably with an El Nino, so a 3-year positive anomaly, 3-year El Nino from 1782 to 4, then a 6-year La Nina, followed by a 4-year El Nino, 1791 to 94. The other cause, the other major factor that has been seen as a cause of global climatic anomalies in the 1780s is the eruption of the Laki fissure, which is part of a volcano in Iceland, which erupted in 1783. It's one of the largest emissions of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere from a North Atlantic volcano, i.e. basically a volcano that isn't in the Ring of Fire around the Pacific. Mikhail, in his study of Egypt, in the underpinning factors for the underpinning facts, he argued basically, what was the cause of the drought in Egypt in the early 1780s, and he argued that was the Laki eruption. Ottoman Iceland. Egypt is under Ottoman rule at this stage. Iceland, volcano, eruption, drought. I want to stress now, this is not consistent with my reading of the Nile records. The Nile records, as I've shown here, the drought starts a year before the eruption, according to the Nile records straight away. And again, this is kind of building on ground zero for the project for this kind of paper. It's like, this seems inconsistent. What's going on here? Closer look at my reading of the Nile records, just a quick look at it makes me question these findings. So I looked for some more sources. So Mikhail looked at the Nile records. He looked at another set of Nile records, which also suggests drought in 1782, but he did not mention that. But I thought, right, I need to look at some more records, see what else I can find. And I found significant support for the 3-year drought. So the other thing I should say as well is that Mikhail claimed that is a 2-year drought instead of a 3-year drought. when clearly this didn't seem to come to be the case in the, this doesn't appear to be the case from the Nile records. So I wanted to find further support, wanted to see if there was further support for this being a 3-year drought. So I started looking at, like, where does the water come from for these Nile records? It comes from the Ethiopian Highlands. So what do we know about climate in the Ethiopian Highlands? Well, we know about climate in the Ethiopian Highlands from work published in the last 10, 15 years on tree rings, on tree ring analyses using dendrochronology. Tommy Wills, who kindly shared me the data for this figure, has been at the forefront of this. I've cited his PhD thesis here, and this is where the figure comes from. I've circled down here a 3-year drought, which he basically estimates as a 3-year drought, 1782 to, and he sees that 3-year drought, the most likely years, as 1782 to 84, according to the tree rings in Highland Ethiopia. This is a PhD thesis, and this has generally been supported by several more recent peer-reviewed works, which I've listed here as well. Basically, in Highland Ethiopia, the width and density of the tree rings are basically a proxy for the rainfall. The samples themselves are taken from the protected forests around Gondar, both north and south of Lake Tana, so in the Northwest Highlands. Oops, too far. So it's not so clear on this figure, but Dr. Tommy Wills kindly shared me the raw data for this figure, and I didn't seek permission to reproduce that data here, so I've not reduced the data, just the figure that's in his PhD thesis. But this idea of a 3-year drought from 1782 to 4 from the tree rings supports my reading, at least, of the Nile River data. And as I said, it's been supported by several peer-reviewed journal articles as well. All of this peer-reviewed data suggests, in its collectivity, suggests a very low runoff for both the Blue Nile and the Tekezi-Atbara complexes, suggesting further that this was a severe 3-year drought that affected the entirety of the Ethiopian highlands, which then had significant consequences for 3 years of the Nile levels in Egypt. This interpretation, furthermore, is supported by evidence from interpretations of global climatic anomalies. According to work by Gebrigorgis et al. And Gleigsner et al., El Nino is the largest driver of interannual rainfall variation in the Ethiopian highlands. This, of course, the 1782 to 4 period corresponds to an El Nino event. Moreover, El Nino appears to have had a large-scale effect, especially in the Indian Ocean world, so regions affected by the Indian Ocean monsoon system, which includes Ethiopia, includes Eastern and Northeastern Africa. There's a drought in and around Madras, present-day now called Chennai, from 1782, contributing to a famine by 1784. Additionally, tree ring evidence in Indonesia, specifically on Java, speak to a 3-year drought beginning in 1782. And recent work in southern China has investigated using climatic models if the Laki Physio eruption had a role in the prevailing climatic conditions in the region at that time, and concluded that the driving factor was El Nino. The effects of the eruption, the Laki eruption, were not felt until 1785. That is after the El Nino had subsided and the eruption's effect globally were diminished. So what I'm kind of investigating here, using, I suppose, a mixture of historical climatological records and those compiling them to make an interpretation of what's going on in Ethiopia right now, is that we have a 3-year drought affecting Northeastern Africa, including Egypt, from 1782 to 4. And this is supported by data from the Nile River in Cairo, and is supported by tree ring evidence in Ethiopia. And then evidence from Ethiopia and the wider Indian Ocean world suggests that this 3-year drought was underpinned by an El Nino anomaly. And I do have to state, so probably maybe up for some contestation, and maybe there'll be some time for some questions on this, not just from the audience here, but from elsewhere, that this interpretation directly contradicts that of Alan Mikhail, who in my view misread the Nilobator readings to suggest it was a 2-year drought in Northeastern Africa, and argued that the Laki fizz eruption was the driving factor behind it. It really looks like an El Nino anomaly was the driving factor, in my view. Okay, so now that I hope I've established the historical climatological context using a variety of proxies for rainfall, the next methodological challenge for this paper, but also for the wider project that I'm working on, is to use what is the importance of this climatological context? What is the importance of this drought? Can I place this drought in history? How did this El Nino driven drought affect Ethiopian history? Now, again, I kind of alluded to the idea that this might be the case already, is that answering this question is in fact very difficult. One of the core issues here is that we have very few primary sources. And in fact, there's only really one that could be even, so that you can even attempt to kind of use to write an environmental history of the Highlands. Only one document at least. And that is the collection of Ethiopian royal chronicles. Specifically, translations of manuscripts that were held in the British Library, presumably pillaged from Ethiopia during the Magdala campaign in 1868. Translations of manuscripts that were held in the British Library, which were made by Herbert Joseph Well Blundell in 1922. These translations, what Blundell in this volume, the Royal Chronicle of Abyssinia, 1769 to 1840. Well Blundell basically translated chronicles compiled by chroniclers who lived with and supported the Ethiopian emperor. This is the only source really that's available, the only documentary source that's available to kind of you can kind of use the climatological records to try and make some interpretations of Ethiopian history. Because the primary source material is so thin, the 1780s have garnered very little attention in Ethiopian history. In earlier and in later periods, the chronicles are supplemented by the reports of Europeans, and for later periods, by the recollections of Ethiopians themselves. Several studies start in 1800, for example, leaving off the 1780s and a lot of the 18th century. In theory, then, the addition of the climatological record opens new avenues of analysis on a period for which very little is known and for which we have very little information. So what are these chronicles? What were the chroniclers doing? When were they written? Or these chronicles were written by chroniclers who were in the Ethiopian emperor's court, and they were written at the time of the events being described. Therefore, historians have generally trusted the dates, have used the dates that are within them to write king lists, for example. They are generally interpreted as primary accounts, not the accounts of scribes writing about times gone by, as was the case in previous centuries. Additionally, these chronicles were written during a period of political instability, known as the Zemani Mesafint, which translate as the era of judges, and that period was 1769 to 1855. Just like in the Book of Judges in the Old Testament, this is a period when basically central power was weak. The emperor was weak in this period, and real power was within judges. or competing regional nobles. This meant that for these chronicles, the chroniclers were actually able to criticize the emperor. The wrath of the emperor was not so great to be feared. They could actually make some criticisms. But there was reluctance, there appears to have been reluctance to do so as well, as James C. McCann has argued. The chroniclers were conflicted about being overly critical. This was because if they were overly critical, they would undermine perceptions of Ethiopia as a centralized Christian empire with a God-anointed emperor at the center. Indeed, in an evocative quotation from the Chronicles, one wrote that he was writing, quote, so that the memory of the kings may not perish. They were at least partly trying to maintain the image during the protracted period of political, maintain the image of Ethiopia as a centralized Christian empire during this protracted period of political upheaval, known as the Zemeni Mesafint. Given these motivations and what they're actually trying to document here about basically life under the emperor, it might not be surprising to you that apart from occasional references to seasonal changes, the chronicles under these versions of the chronicles do not comment on climate or weather at all. And so they don't mention a drought in 1782-4. Perhaps more surprising, though, is that there are not even any possible symptoms from such a severe drought mentioned either. The most obvious one here is famine, which has been heavily tied to drought in Ethiopian history over the long durée. Now, there's a large historiography here which looks at the possible linkages between drought and famine in Ethiopian history, which I'll unfortunately largely have to skip over. But just as a kind of acknowledgement here that it is a nuanced linkage. So there's no reference to famine in 1782-4 either, but there are references to famines during other times around here. These two other times are 1772-3 and 1788-9. And given that they're written, these chronicles are written at the time, and historians have generally accepted the dates, historians writing in both the 1980s and 2010s have used these dates, so 1772-3 and 1788-9, as listed as famine, to illustrate long-term trends of climatic and environmental instability. That is, they've trusted the dates, using the Ethiopian World Chronicle dates as famines, or the dates of the most severe, and they've kind of used these dates to suggest that these were the dates of the most severe subsistence crises during the Zemeni Mesafint. By contrast, though, of course, the climatological record, which I've already displayed to you, suggests that alternative dates were more severe, at least in climatic terms, at least in terms of the influence of drought. In addition, both 1772-3 and 1788-9, both of these dates appear to have coincided with fairly abundant rainfall. That is according to the mixture of the nilometer records, the tree rings, and the multi-proxy records of global climatic anomalies, such as El Nino. So how do I unpick this? Well, I'm going to tell you what my argument is before I justify that. My argument here is that these dates for famine in the Ethiopian World Chronicles are reflective of political conditions more than environmental conditions in the Ethiopian highlands. In both these instances, 1772-3 and 1788-9, the emperor or his associates were able to provide relief for famine. And I believe that the chronicler was actually referring to the act of giving relief than to the famine itself. To not be able to provide relief would impinge on the image of Ethiopia as a centralized Christian empire. It was a long-held tradition that the emperor should be able to provide a minimum of food to survive for his subjects. To not do so, or not be able to do so, would bring into question his legitimacy, and therefore also the image of Ethiopia as this centralized Christian empire. Thus, the reports of famine are actually reports of relief provision. To start with the example in 1772 to 3. Okay. The report of famine in 1772 to 3 comes at the end of a civil war. In 1771, a new emperor was installed in the throne, Lahaymanot II. And in the chronicler's eyes, he was there to reassert the authority of the Ethiopian kings. The war itself, which lasted from 1769 to 71, destroyed the countryside around Gondar, the seat of the emperor, which certainly could have contributed to a subsistence crisis, as reported as a famine in the chronicles. And in times of such suffering, it was expected that the emperor and his court would provide relief. In this instance, that role, according to the chronicler, fell to Queen Mengweap, who, by the time of the report, had just died. The chronicler wrote, "Queen Mengweap gave food to the hungry and was the hope of the people and of those who lived far and near. She gave joy to the poor and needy. She clothed the naked and starving." Thus, in 1772 to 3, the chronicler documented the famine in the context of the emperor and his courts being able to take concrete measures to alleviate it. This context then provided the eulogy for the recently deceased queen. The context for the 1788 to 9 famine report in the Chronicles has some similarities. Again, 1788 to 9 is at the end, are years in the immediate aftermath of war, which likely contributed to hardship. But by this time, the emperor's influence was severely diminished, and power instead lay more concretely with nobles emanating from Oromo in the southwest. These nobles from Oromo were new converts to Christianity from Islam, and whose conversion to many was dubious. The chronicler's report, though, focuses on another noble, the Jasmach Hailu Eshti, who is a veteran military commander who had remained near to the central power since Lahaymanot's reign in the 1770s. And here's the quotation. "And the Jasmach Hailu did many kindnesses at that time, and at one time, which was the year of Matiwas, which is 1788 to 9, when there was a famine over all the provinces, there came over to him many needy people in their great distress, whom he settled in his villages as guards. And hearing of this report about Jasmach Hailu, many commanders who acted as he did adopted his example for themselves." Hailu's role provided a key continuity from the 1770s, who represented to the chroniclers the influence of the emperor, despite the rise of centrifugal forces, as well as evidence for the ongoing existence of Ethiopia as a centralized Christian empire. The chroniclers compared Hailu favorably to Emperor Ambeseyon I, who was a celebrated Christian crusader who expanded and unified the Ethiopian empire during the medieval period. And they compared him favorably also to the biblical David, which was a privilege that was usually reserved only for the emperor himself. They even sometimes referred to him as "my lord" in capitals, in the manner of the Christian God. In this extract, Hailu is shown to bring legitimacy to the regime dominated by new converts to Christianity from Oromo, who were traditionally Muslim. He and his influence, and therefore by association the emperor's influence as well, urged the ruling nobles to act in a way that befitted a legitimate central power in Ethiopia, that is, by providing relief in a time of subsistence crisis. By contrast, in 1782 to 4, there was no one in the chronicler's eyes who befitted the emperorship in a way that could provide relief. This was during Tekle Georgis I's first reign. He actually had 5 reigns, all before 1800, which goes to show the kind of political instability and changes that were happening at this time. During his first reign, the chroniclers portray him as a usurper from the north, specifically from Tigray region. He was imprisoned by Lahaymanot during Lahaymanot's reign, and in the chronicler's eyes, Lahaymanot was a righteous and rightful emperor. And in the early 1780s, his power was rooted in the support of the Oromo nobles, who I alluded to earlier. But crucially, I think, according to the chronicler's chronology, they had yet to these Oromo nobles who supported Georges had yet to convert to Christianity. They converted to Christianity later, 1785 or in 1785 or 1786. This meant, according to the chroniclers of the time, they were still Muslims, which went against the foundations of what the chroniclers understood about Ethiopia as a centralized Christian empire. Moreover, Georges and the nobles from Oromo disrespected Djazmach Hailu Eshte in, according to the chronicler, traitorous circumstances on several occasions. The chronicler wrote that upon taking the throne, Georges and his supporters sent for Hailu, saying, "Come quickly." And on that, the Djazmach Hailu went at once and was received by them, and then lying men rose up against him, and they harassed him with evil deeds. On another occasion, nobles in support of Georges bound Hailu with, quote, with chains of iron, causing grief among all the people of Gondar, every kinsman and friend, because he, that is Hailu, had been tyrannically chained. On several occasions in the early 1780s, Hailu is portrayed as trying to reconcile with the emperor, only for the emperor to betray him. There was no one in the chronicler's eyes who befitted the emperorship, who embodied this Highland Christian empire, that could provide relief in the case of a subsistence crisis. So did this subsistence crisis take place, therefore? Was there a subsistence crisis in 1782 to 4? There's always going to be a bit of conjecture when you answer that question. But apart from the climatological evidence and possibly linking drought with famine, which you never want to do in kind of a linear way, there is other evidence in the Ethiopian Royal Chronicles that suggests that this would have been a very severe period on the environment, making life very difficult for the general populace in and around Gondar. As in 1772 to 3 and 1788 to 9, the period 1782 to 4, that is the period of this big drought, which we've identified from the climatological sources, this was a period characterized by warfare, which resulted in the dethronement of Georges by the same Oromo nobles who previously supported him. And this warfare ravaged the countryside around Gondar and elsewhere in present-day Amhara. Thus, if we accept that the emperors and their courts provide relief from shortages in 1772 to 3 and 1788 to 9, following a period of violent political instability, well, there are similar levels of political instability that pervaded the period 1782 to 4 as well. Only this time, this violence that characterized this instability was accompanied by a once-in-a-century level drought as well, which almost certainly exacerbated any war-related shortages that there were. The point to make here is that the combination of political instability and drought, I think, quite likely contributed to a subsistence crisis in Highland Ethiopia in 1782 to 4. Even though this crisis is not mentioned explicitly in the chronicles, I think that making this conclusion is supported by the climate proxy records, as well as by a critical reading of the chronicles themselves. And this suggests that there is a new approach to documenting long-term patterns of environmental stress in Eastern, Northeastern African history is needed, at least for the deeper past, for which we have limited source materials, particularly documents. And this approach should rely on an integration of interdisciplinary methods from historical climatology and climate history. And these methods allow for new insights to be gained from rereading and reinterpreting well-known Africanist sources, including the Ethiopian Royal Chronicles. Now, I want to kind of use this as kind of a blueprint for wider study in equatorial regions as well, on which the original project focuses much more concretely. There are several challenges here though, and ones that I'm trying to resolve, and I'm in no position to be able to present on the results of these potential resolutions. I'm still working on them. But there are other challenges. I've kind of mentioned a couple of them already. One, that the Nile records are a less useful proxy for equatorial regions. Also, although we know that phenomena such as El Nino affect climate and rainfall in equatorial regions, we're less certain about exactly how they do so. And they only appear to affect one of two rainy seasons, which means even if you can get a perfect you couldn't do this, but imagine if you did get a perfect model for showing how El Nino affects rainfall in Eastern Africa, you only get it for one of two seasons, which means for the default path, you still don't know how rain is falling in another one. Also, apart from the Nile records, which have gaps in, are imperfect, we don't have any records in the region with an annual time series. There are no tree ring studies yet, and we're only reliant on pollen and lake sediments instead, which are better indicating long-term trends than annual changes or annual variations. And Ethiopia, I kind of said that the chronicles are limited. We are limited by primary sources because we're only reliant on the chronicles of the 1780s. Well, we don't even have those for equatorial regions. We are reliant on oral traditions instead, which are notoriously difficult to place in time. I am currently trying to combat these challenges. Currently, by exploring the usage of a multi-proxy reconstruction of global climate, which at present only goes back to 1836, though some preliminary research suggests we could go back to 1806. And work, as colleagues here know at the IOWC, know that I'm working in collaborations with some research assistants here at the IOWC to see if this is a reasonable methodology for getting at least not even just a yearly time series, but also actually a monthly time series going back to the early 19th century. So only at the very early stages of that at the moment, and even that, just seeing if this is actually a feasible approach or not. But I think the idea, the principle of using this interdisciplinary mixture of, I suppose, well-known Africanist sources and new climatological sources can be a useful approach for writing an environmental or a climate history and equatorial Eastern Africa as well. All right, I'll wrap up there.